Let you know. Okay, in three, two, one.
Great day, MountainCare. Hope that this video finds all of you doing well, staying healthy, finding something fun to do. I thought that today we might take a couple of minutes and learn a little bit more about the weather. As many of you know, my son Evan is studying meteorology at the College of Charleston. That's him here with us today. And I thought maybe we would take some time to interview Evan, ask him a little bit of some questions about the weather and more specifically about a storm chasing trip that he took just about a year ago now. So Evan, with that, I'm going to start out by asking you a couple of questions. The one that I'm sure many people have asked you before, and I bet a lot of my folks would be interested in knowing, and that is, how did you first become interested in studying the weather?
Well, I think I've been interested in the weather for a long time. Ever since I would say maybe the second or third grade, I was just fascinated by all the clouds and the thunderstorms that we would get back when we used to live kind of in the flatlands of North Carolina. And it was all just so magical, and I didn't understand it at the time, but it was super interesting. And then, right, that's when I was 12 years old, middle school, early middle school, there was a hurricane, Hurricane Sandy, that impacted the northeastern United States. It was very severe in its impacts, but it actually led to snow in North Carolina, which was very unusual. And it hasn't happened before and hasn't happened since. But with this one particular hurricane, it did. And at the time, my dad went up to areas that were affected by snow to go see it, to go see this once in a lifetime phenomenon. But he left me in school, and I was really bummed out because as a burgeoning weather geek, I was really hoping to go and super interested in it. But I got left behind. But it's not the end of the world. It spurred me on to want to learn more and to see some of these events for myself. And I think that's what has slowly and gradually gotten me to the point of being in school and going to college to study meteorology, and hoping to pursue a lifelong career in this field.
Great. MountainCare folks, that time that Evan is referring to with Hurricane Sandy is the time that in our family we affectionately refer to as the time that Dad ditched Evan so that he
Uh,
could go do storm chasing himself and enjoy that snow. In his defense, it was his birthday weekend, so we felt like that was our gift to him, right, Evan?
it was, yeah, it's understandable. I've forgiven him.
There you go. Oh, have you? Okay, that's good. All right. Well, how about next question? Maybe Evan would be, tell us do you have a particular type of weather that's your favorite to study?
I do. So I'm not sure when this fascination began. Once again, I would say that it has to do with my dad because my dad loved these kind of events. But there's this type of weather that we get here in Western North Carolina, here in Asheville, called Northwest Flow snowfall. And basically, it's snow that comes out of kind of the Midwest area. And as it approaches Asheville, it all of a sudden precipitates very heavy, and we get a lot of big snow, especially on the tops of the bigger mountains around here. And it comes with some very high winds, sometimes winds gusting beyond 100 miles an hour, which is well into hurricane strength, up above 5,000 feet near here. So it's very unusual, and many people wouldn't expect that the conditions are that severe on the higher peaks. When here in Asheville, it may be a 50-degree day, with some light showers and a little bit of clouds, and just 20 miles away as the crow flies on Mount Mitchell, which is the highest peak east of the Mississippi. It's blowing snow, you can't see, and it's completely treacherous, and no one could drive in that. So I love how quickly the conditions can change in this area in particular. This picture that I'm showing right here, this was, I think, we call it a snow chase. But my dad and mom and I will occasionally go up to one of the bigger mountains near Asheville to go see the snow after one of these events has happened. So this was a picture from Roan Mountain, which is about an hour and a half north of Asheville. It was taken maybe 2 or 3 years ago now. And all of the stuff that you see, it kind of looks like white coral. That's actually ice. So we call it rime ice that is accumulated on all of the little plants up there. And you can see that we're in the clouds at the moment. You can't see any blue sky there, but the clouds freeze onto these plants. And that's basically what rime ice is. And as well, you can see You can see the snow on the ground there. So I would say that's my favorite kind of weather and what keeps me the most interested. I do some research in this area when I'm in school. Then I actually started assisting with some research as far back as high school with a local professor at UNC Asheville. So I really love this, and it fascinates me. And maybe I spend a little bit too much time studying it and researching it and monitoring it. And Mom could certainly attest. But it's very interesting.
Excellent. I want you to know, Mountain Care, that I think Evan is doing me a kindness by saying that mom and dad and Evan like to go snow chasing. Oftentimes, mom just wants to be left behind because she gets a little bit nervous in that snowy weather.
The roads can be rather treacherous sometimes, and it's very cold up there. Sometimes the winds can be so strong and temperatures so cold that it feels like it's uh, sometimes below zero, which is it's very uncomfortable. So mom sometimes makes the smarter choices by staying at home.
That's kind of him to say. All right, well, Evan, how about if we move on and you can begin to tell us about your trip? So, about a year ago, May, well, it is May, a year ago, Evan got to take a storm chasing trip for roughly 10 days, I believe, out in the Midwest with some other meteorology people. So I'll have him tell you a little bit about that, hopefully show you some pictures, maybe tell you what some of his most famous or favorite moments were and things like that. So Ev, take it away.
Yeah, so we were out west for 10 days, I believe, and it was arguably the best 10 days of my life. We spent the whole time driving from state to state. We started in Colorado, and I'll walk y'all through kind of our progression. So actually, technically, we started in North Carolina, right? Because we were starting here in Asheville. And if we animate this, we flew up to Michigan before briefly going to Colorado, and we landed in Colorado, which was kind of our going to be our main state. That was going to be the state where we chased tornadoes. We wanted to get as close as we could to these big storms that were dropping tornadoes out in the prairie lands. And we rented a car. And throughout this 10-day experience, we actually traveled and drove through 6 separate states. So we started out in Colorado, and we did stints in Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And in that time, we saw 14 tornadoes, I believe. I've got the number written down. We'll go look at that in a second. But we saw 14 tornadoes. And even from some of the storms that did not produce tornadoes like we were hoping, they were just beautiful, beautiful storms with a lot of times we like to look for structure, which is these pretty smooth edges on the storms. We saw a couple of those, and I'll flash a picture up here in a second as well. But it was just so unique. It's a part of the country that I've been to Colorado before, but only to the mountains. I've never spent any time in the prairies out there. So eastern Colorado and Kansas and those other states are vastly different from the Rockies that rise up out of the prairie just a few miles, 60 miles, less than that, west of Denver. Uh, and you can see for forever, and there's nothing out there. And truthfully, I loved it. There were places in Colorado we would be sitting in a field waiting for a storm, and as far as the eye could see, horizon to horizon, there was nothing but fields. There was no outbuildings. There were no tractors. There were no people. There were no cars. It was just grass. And we would wait, and you could slowly see that the clouds would get more and more bubbly as the day progressed, and it would get hotter and hotter, and the winds would start to get really stiff out of the southeast. And those are all of the ingredients that we're starting to look for a day that could potentially produce tornadoes. And typically by 2, 3, maybe even 4 p.m., we would start to see storms firing, as we call it, starting to just explode upwards and getting super tall, upwards of 60, 70,000 feet. And when that happened, that's when we knew that the game was afoot, and we started chasing. And it's a bit of a tricky situation because if you're on the wrong side of the storm, obviously there's a lot of risk with tornadoes. You don't want to be too close to the tornado. But it's not just tornadoes we have to fear. There's also hail and flooding concerns and very strong non-tornadic winds in the heart of a supercell. And just real quick, a supercell is one of these storms that is really tall, like we talked about, 60,000 feet, and potentially could produce a tornado. And they're typically very long-lived. So we had to be conscious of all of those threats as we went throughout our day, every day. And I believe we were out there for 10 days. We saw 14 tornadoes, but most of those tornadoes came in the first 2 days, actually. The first day, I believe we saw somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 tornadoes in Colorado. And then the second day, we traveled over to Kansas. And that was going to be a high risk day, as we call it. There was a very good chance of seeing tornadoes. And we actually drove all the way from western Kansas over to eastern Kansas near the Missouri state border before we realized that the storms were actually going to be in western Kansas. So we made a mistake in our forecast and had to drive hours and hours, 3 or 4 hours back west to get to where we had started that morning. We actually ended up in the same city that we had slept in that night or the night before, which is painfully ironic, but it's okay. And we got there just in time to crest a ridge, and we saw this beautiful bowl-shaped tornado come out of a magnificent 70,000-foot storm. It's perfectly lit by the sun over this field of just waving grain. It was a true plains prairie moment, as typical as you could expect the prairie to be. That is exactly what it looked like. And that tornado ended up being half a mile wide, and it was the biggest tornado that we saw the whole trip. But it was just such a unique experience because you spend every day living and breathing the weather. Before you go to bed every night, you're checking forecast models, which is basically like a computer generated method of figuring out where the storms are going to be the next day. So we would spend every night dissecting those computer models, trying to figure out where did we want to drive the next morning? Where did we want to sit and wait for the storms to explode and fire up? And some days, unfortunately, there were no storms. We spent a day, and actually we spent 2 days just sitting around in Oklahoma with nothing going on. There were no storms anywhere on the prairie. So we went to an air show and looked at airplanes. And then the next day we drove around and went to some beautiful locations in Oklahoma. And I was perplexed by the beauty of the plains. It's so flat, and like I said, there's nothing out there. But it's so different from around here. There's no trees, there's no mountains like there are near Asheville. There's not as much wildlife as there is here. It's just a different world out there. So it was a lot of fun, and I love visiting each and every one of these states.
Excellent. Although I have one question. I
Yeah.
don't see how that's any different from any of the other days that you eat, breathe, and sleep the weather.
That's true. That's true. It's just maybe a different mode of weather. We were living and breathing tornadoes while we were out west, and while
Oh,
I'm here, I'm living and breathing snow during the
gotcha.
winter.
All right, keep going. Do you have any other photos to show us?
Yeah, absolutely. So real quick, and I kind of made a cheesy animation, but we did travel as far south as the Mexican border. We actually got within 30 miles of the Mexican border at one point. And just some statistics here. We did drive 5,000, more than 5,000 miles over the 10 days that we were out west, saw 14 tornadoes, 6 states. This is kind of just a reiteration of that graphic that I just showed. But this just goes to show how immense our our storm chase was. We spend upwards of 16 hours a day in a car driving. It was taxing and exhausting. Luckily, I did not have to do any of the driving. We had a designated driver, and he was very good at what he did. Um, but 16 hours a day in a car is long, and we stayed every night in a hotel. We never had reservations. Every night you just show up and hope that there's rooms. So it can get a little bit stressful at times because there's always an unknown variable. Um, but to kind of change away from the statistics of the trip and go into some of the more fun, picturesque moments, I would say that my favorite state was Colorado. And it is a hard thing for me to choose because every state that we visited was so magnificent. Kansas was unique for its big rolling green hills. Oklahoma is unique for its drastically changing topography, where there'd be canyons and there'd be mountains. Texas was very cool because it actually has very large mountains that we encountered while chasing a storm, and then we got lost in the mountains. That was a bit unfortunate. We didn't see any storms that day because we got lost in the mountains. But we spent the most time in Colorado. I would say we probably spent 4 to 5 days in Colorado chasing storms just because it's so predictable there. It's easy. Every single day there's storms, basically no matter where you are. And this is a picture from just north of Yuma, Colorado, which is a little prairie city. Not many people live there. But this is one of the most beautiful storms we encountered the whole trip. We saw this on our very first day. We had only been on the ground in a car for maybe 4 or 5 hours when we got to this point and just saw this storm, and the sun was setting, and we sat there in this exact spot and waited for over an hour. And as it slowly approached, it just got this beautiful structure. You can see the smooth edges as the air is flowing into the storm and then rushing up and out. There was so much to dissect in this moment, and we were all just kind of slack jawed at the meteorology that was going on here and all the fascinating details. And it is worth mentioning here that this photo and all the photos that I'm getting ready to share was taken by one of our fellow chasers, Chris Jackson, who's been gracious enough to let us borrow the photos for this event. But just a beautiful, beautiful storm. And to kind of go on, the next day had my favorite moment. So my favorite moment was not that beautiful storm that I just showed you, but it was actually the next day in Kansas. And if you remember the half-mile wide, the bowl-shaped tornado that I was talking about that we encountered in Kansas, this right here is that tornado. So the tornado that you see on the left, even though it's real skinny and tall at this point, is that tornado. When we first pulled up, it was very short and very fat. It had just formed under the storm and was just churning through the prairie, throwing up trees and grass. Luckily, only hit one small farm and damaged some farm equipment. So no one was injured, and very few people suffered damages to the property. But as the storm continued over the next half hour, the tornado got really skinny, as you can see in this photo. It got super tall and actually got separated from the storm that it was in. So in this exact moment, that tornado on the left was beginning to dissipate, as we call it. It was beginning to die and fall away. And shortly after this, it would actually completely disappear and lift off the ground. But there was another tornado on the bottom right, you can see, that was forming, and it took over as the main tornado in that cell. And it went on to continue churning through the prairie for another, I believe, 30 to 40 miles. So this storm was fascinating because at this exact moment when this photo was taken, we're sitting on a ridge watching the storm progress, just oohing and ahhing and celebrating that we got in there in time. And you can't see the third tornado, unfortunately, in this photo. But just further to the right where you can't see, there was actually a third tornado on the ground. So we had 3 tornadoes on the ground, all of them in eye shot at the same time, which is incredibly rare. And it was really neat, but it was also a little scary because it's easy to keep track of one tornado. Well, I say easy. It can be difficult to keep track of one tornado, but in a situation like this where it's clearly visible and we're far enough away from it, we're not going to be hit by that. But when you have 2 or 3 tornadoes on the ground at once, all of a sudden we start getting a little bit nervous that one person has to have their eye on each tornado at the same time because they can move in different ways and be very erratic and unpredictable. So we did get a bit concerned, and we actually ended up retreating from this storm for a little while before it once again consolidated into a singular tornado, and then we went on to chase it. But I would have to say that is my favorite moment. And Mom, if you're okay, if you don't have any questions, I'll go ahead and transition into some of our favorite pictures. So this was, once again, our first day. Our first 2 days were so jam-packed. I talk about them constantly. But this was the first evening after we had seen the beautiful storm that I showed you earlier with the beautiful structure. This was just after the sun had set near the Nebraska Colorado state line. And wow, was it just a beautiful, beautiful moment. We pulled off the road right at the state line and pulled into a field, kind of got our cameras out and just watched as the storm unloaded a barrage of lightning. And it was all perfectly captured in this starlit setting. The sky was completely clear with the exception of this one perfect storm. The stars out there are unbelievably beautiful. There's no big cities nearby. You can see this one little city in the distance here in the photo, but it's dark out there, unlike Asheville, where you can see stars, but it's kind of tough to make out the Milky Way sometimes. In Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado and Oklahoma, when you're away from the big cities, it is truly dark and there's very little light pollution. And this is one of those perfect instances where we got to watch this storm for over an hour just churn and produce lightning nonstop as the stars slowly tilted overhead. It was a very magical moment. And for the first day going into it, not truly knowing what to expect, it was one of those moments. It was like, wow, is it really this good? Is this really what it's like every day? Unfortunately, it wasn't, but the next day was a treat. And this was actually that same storm. So there were, I guess, a few other little clouds in the sky. But this was a picture that, once again, my buddy Chris took, and that is me standing there, and you can just see all of the stars laid out, and that is exactly what it looked like. It really was that beautiful. It's not a camera trick. There were just stars everywhere, and it was magnificent. And those little lines that you can see, a couple of them are satellites, and one of them is a plane, but you can actually see satellites streaking through space from the ground. So if you've never noticed them, it's kind of a neat thing to look up and see in the sky. Now, this was the half-mile wide bowl shaped tornado that I was talking about earlier. This was basically right when we first saw it. We'd come over this hill, and all of a sudden we saw it descending to the ground. We freaked out. We start yelling and clapping and cheering, and we're jumping out of the car to take pictures. Um, and at this point, we were pretty far away. We were 4 or 5 miles away from the storm, so we were having to zoom in real close on our cameras. But we could see that this tornado was just massive, and it was connected to a monster storm. And you can kind of see in the detail here, you can see the small, it looks very, very short in this photo, but you can see the tornado at the bottom, right near the ground, and just above it is what we call a wall cloud. So that is the general area of rotation, but at the base of a storm. So that's where, if you're going to get a tornado, it's going to come out of a wall cloud. It's going to come out of that broad rotation and be a much more specific, small rotation, much stronger, and that is where you get a tornado. That's kind of how a tornado is born. But this, I mentioned the field of wheat that the storm was portrayed over, and that's exactly what this was. The field was just gently swaying back and forth with waves of the wind. Yeah, it was just magnificent.
It's
Once
very
again,
Americana looking,
it
isn't it?
was exactly. It makes me think of America, beautiful. Um, and this is bouncing back. Unfortunately, I don't have my timeline straight, but this is back to the first day, back in Colorado, and you can kind of see that there was no tornado on the ground at this moment, but that kind of cloud that's coming down out of the other clouds on the left-hand side, that
Okay.
was the wall cloud like that I just talked about, and that storm actually produced somewhere between 7 and 8 um, tornadoes in the span of an hour. They were all very short-lived and very weak, just kicked up some dust, and we were very close to them at this point. Um, but those were
Now,
the first tornadoes that we saw the whole trip. Off to the right, on the right side of the photo, you can see a darker shade that doesn't look like the sky, and that's what we call a rain foot. It's a weird name for it, but that is where the heaviest precipitation, all of the heavy rain, all of the hail was falling over there. And we, shortly before this photo, we had actually been trapped in that rain foot, and we had to drive through roads that were covered in inches of hail. That is how much hail and frozen precipitation was falling out of the sky, and it was just pinging off the car. It was a bit of a scary moment for us, as we'd only been in the car for a few hours, and we were worried, oh man, we've already dented this rental vehicle, but luckily there was no damage to that. I don't know what day this was. I believe this was near the end of our trip, one of our last days, and we'd circled back around to Colorado before coming home. And we didn't see any tornadoes this day, but we were treated to this wonderful sunset and rainbow right at the very end, just all the way across the sky. And it was a double rainbow. It's kind of hard to see in this photo, but if you look closely, you can faintly see the outline of that second double. And actually, in this moment, this was very unexpected, but we actually had a dust storm just before this. So if you look at the bottom left, right where the sky and the bottom left side of the rainbow meet the ground, you can kind of see a bit of a brownish color at the base of the sky. And that was actually a dust storm that was moving away. So a storm had died and collapsed in on itself. And it just created this huge gust of wind that went out across the prairie and that picked up all of the dust in the fields and on the roads and carried it along with it. So this probably the most beautiful sunset we saw the entire trip. And that is the end of my photos, Mom.
excellent. Could you put us back to full size?
Yes,
Excellent. There we are. Well, thank you, Evan. That was fantastic.
absolutely.
Um,
Thank you for having me on.
I appreciate you taking the time to show us all these photos and really give us a good explanation of some of the things that you saw while you were out there. Thanks for not giving me too many scary details because I'm your mom and, moms worry. Um,
Absolutely.
but I hope that MountainCare, I hope you folks enjoyed this and that you had learned a little bit maybe about the weather. And oh, wait, before we disband this meeting, I wanted to ask you what your future aspirations are as a meteorologist.
Oh, yeah, great question. So I don't know exactly what I want to do yet in the weather field, but I am, as we mentioned earlier, in college, in school for a meteorology degree. And that can be multiple things. I could work on TV, as a lot of people would recognize. Locally, we have Jason Boyer and other people like that. So I could work in TV. I could do something like that. But there's also opportunities to work for, like I could work for farmers out west who need weather information to grow their crops. Um, there are a handful of professional storm chasers that actually make money off of it. Unfortunately, I won't be able to pay the bills storm chasing. I'm not a good enough photographer. But who knows? I could work for the National Weather Service, which is the branch of, or it is a business basically run by the government and funded by the government and taxpayer dollars to forecast and provide reliable weather information for the entire nation. So we'll see where I end up in 2 to 3 years. Who knows?
That sounds great. Well, thank you again, Evan. We appreciate your time. Mountain Care, you guys have a great rest of the day. See you next time.